Three things I'll do in this debate. First, let me set up the framing and characterization. Then my first claim is prevent crimes of passion. Second is about more rational decision making. Lastly, I'll talk about how we have better relationships and fosters better relationships between people. So first, let's do some framing. In the status quo, people who go through extreme emotions become suicidal, have extreme mood swings like bipolar disorder, high blood pressure from extreme happiness, and a major part of the horrendous crimes are crimes of passion. People kill over extreme angers and impulse. These problems in the status quo do not exist in our world, and that's what Gov has to defend. What is extreme emotion? It's characterized by its intensity, duration, and significant impact it has on a person's mind and way to think. The difference between moderately in love and extremely madly in love is that in their world, it is close to impossible to opt out with extreme emotional connections with your partner. In our world, people can be moderately happy and moderately sad. When we broke finalists, we were pretty happy, but not extremely happy enough to the point it lasts for days and we binge eat ourselves. The opposite is defend being depressed for a week, so mad that you have to stab a friend to death, so happy that you binge eat yourself into health problems, and it looks like being so depressed a child stays home for a week. Our point about prevention of crimes of passion, right? People make rushed decisions at the heat of the moment, from the extreme emotion they feel, and they feel the need to act upon it in the moment without logic. Why? Two layers of reasoning. The first, the more emotion a person has, the less logic they have, right? There's a capacity for the mind, and it's a push and pull situation. When you have extreme emotion, you have to have extremely reduced logic. Second, extremely emotion is extremely overwhelming and extremely prolonged that affects your ability to think logically and clearly. So the impact is that on our side, where there are no extreme emotions, you have less crimes of passion from emotional actions, right? Generally less conflicts arising because people are usually acting under the extreme emotion on that time in the status quo. In the Gov world, we have individuals being able to calm down when facing conflicts, calm down when being angry. Thus, we have far less impulsive crimes of passion, and we make the society better overall. Yes, I'll take your POI before going to the second point.
Don't you think that there will also be a massive rise in psychopathic crimes because people do not feel extreme empathy for victims?
I'll actually talk about empathy and why rationality actually goes and leads to empathy. Right into my second part, rational decision making, right? Extreme emotions take away logic, but rationality is actually how we have empathy. Let me explain. Rationality brings you to think in the other person's side and see it from the other person's perspective when you're extremely mad, right? That is exactly how you can be empathetic. When you're extremely mad, you're probably only thinking about yourself. However, when you have that last bit of logic and you have that last bit of rationality, you can actually think it from the other person's perspective. Only from rationality and logic can we have empathy. That is something that op cannot argue for. We create a better society overall and more lasting solution. Why do I say that? Because extreme emotions create short-term solvency. Let me give an example. People often regret quitting marriage and saying goodbye to their partners after a while, right? That is because that is a crime, that is an action on the spot. That is due to the extreme emotions they felt at that time. On our side, we can also quit marriage and escape these relationships, but it's only for a better reason, right? They're more rational and make choices they do not regret. That is because they're able to have that rationality when they're moderately happy or moderately mad, right? They're still able to feel these emotions. The difference is we are not doing things on the spot and for the short term. In our world, we have people making better decisions, not regretting their decisions and living better lives, right? This means that only in our side, we have better lives and happier lives for those because they have more rational decisions and make these decisions at the important times. Thirdly, why we build better relationships, right? It's because people have more ability to understand each other. No, thank you. So, first point about improved communication and understanding, right? The premise is that extreme emotions often hinder clear communication and understanding in relationships. And without the interference of extreme emotions, individuals can communicate more effectively and empathetically, as I've explained, right? The impact is that fewer misunderstandings and miscommunications happen, right? Where do these things usually happen? They happen when one person is extremely mad. One person thinks you're cheating or thinks that you have gone away, right? It leads to more harmonious interactions, right? Because it enhances the ability to listen and respond constructively to the other person and fostering these deeper connections and trust and relationships, right? The greater emotional availability and presence strengthens the bond between people. And this is really important because having this empathetic communication is the foundation of healthy relationships, right? Being able to see the problem for the other person's side is important. And these relationships means a better society overall also. And second, about actual problem solving and why you
Point
get
of
this
information.
society. Yes, I'll take another point.
Do you support any emotions existing at all since you love rationality so much?
Of course, I support emotion, right? Of course, you can be moderately happy and moderately sad. What you have to defend is someone being illogical completely, right? As long as we believe there's a bit of logic and some logic to stop you from killing a person on the spot, to stop you from being depressed for weeks, to stop a child from binge eating himself in health problems, we believe that is okay. Of course, we love emotions. It's just that in some cases, we still need rationality. And often in those cases is where you have extreme emotion. The problems only arise in their world. We support moderate emotions. Now, on to my last point about problem solving and cooperation, right? Extreme emotions impede this problem solving abilities because, like I explained, one, also, like I've explained, in these situations where you have extreme emotions, you have extremely reduced logic. Note that, of course, we can have moderate emotions, right? I've explained in most cases, moderate emotion is fine. Only in the cases of extreme emotions do we need actual logic, and does that harm come into play, right? Moderately happy does not make you bingy for weeks. Moderately depressed does not make you depressed for weeks. Only in their case does this happen. So with fewer extreme emotions, individuals and people can approach these problems more calmly and collaboratively, right? You can talk to your partner, talk to your spouse about what has happened, right? You can feel moderately sad about what has happened and talk to them, right? Only from our side, with this logic, while feeling moderately sad, can you solve these problems and move forward. From this, we foster better relationships and have a better community overall, right? This increased willingness to compromise and have mutual benefit outcomes is crucial on our side, right? Being empathetic is crucially related to being logical and thinking from the other person's perspective and understanding what the other person thinks. It is close to impossible to do that in the op side where you are extremely mad or extremely depressed at the moment. I'm so proud to propose. Thank you so much. Proposition ballot.
The ability to experience the extremes in the ebbs and flows of life is a necessary and integral part of the human condition. It's the feeling of tearing up your exam paper of rage, the feeling of willing to do anything for love, and the feeling when you weep on the floor that makes us uniquely human. And we do not want to live in a sanitized room without extreme emotions. Some set up before I move on to my speech proper. Our world would basically look similar to the current world we live in, where people experience both a large range of intensity in their emotions, which is proportional to how much this person interprets any particular situation. So, for example, if I get taunted by my friend, I'll feel low intensity anger. And if I feel betrayed or see an egregious act, I'll feel high intensity anger. Of course, people have means to regulate their emotions. We have things such as laws and social order to ensure we do not always scream when we walk on the streets. What propositions will look like is a world where the experience spectrum is far lower. Let's say the maximum scale in our world is 0 to 100, theirs is 0 to 50. But before I continue, let's inspect that case. They give us 3 main pushes for the house today. I'm going to take down all of them and show you why, even if you don't buy that, we still win. First, they tell us that their side prevents crimes of passion. 4 responses to this. 1, there's just a lot of reasons why this won't happen, like laws, social norms, and intense fear of punishment, by the way, and logic. Like, if you lock children inside a room, obviously they'd be safer, but we don't do that because it takes away from the human experience. There's a reason why. Second, extreme situations naturally call for extreme emotions. If my dog dies, I want to feel sad about it. It's good and normal to feel sad about it. If my best friend dies, it's good that I feel sad, and it's incredibly disgusting if I don't. If I get assaulted on the street, I think it's good that I feel anger, so I fight back and beat him up. Extreme emotions catalyze how we perceive and internalize the world. And thirdly, for every bad emotion, there's a good emotion, so it probably balances out in terms of utility. And finally, even if you don't buy all of this, I'll show you why this isn't as important as compared to our substantives. Second, they tell us that rationality leads to empathy on their side. Note that they don't actually tell us why that's unique to their side because we can still have this. But yes, logic allows you to have empathy. But if you have very, very weak emotions, you won't have empathy because if helping or empathizing with someone nets you an overall negative utility decrease, you won't help them. We have logic on our side, but they can't have strong empathy that makes us human. Finally, that push on better relationships. They give us an example on your
JiaYi.
partner cheating on you. No, thank you. They give us an example on your partner cheating on you and you being able to resolve the situation. But in that case, we think it's good to feel intense anger and you break up with them. They need to defend staying in this relationship and thinking you can solve this when it's quite clear you won't. We think it's outright disgusting not to feel mad when your partner betrays you and cheats on you. And note how we also flip this, because now you can't feel intense love for your partner. Now you can't have the happy moments. Like, sure, maybe to some extent you don't have as many angry moments, but you also don't have the happy moments, which we think what gives life meaning. I'll show why there's perverse and viscerally evil in my substantives. All right. I think we can all agree that emotions in and of themselves are extremely important. And clearly neither side wants to defend a world where no emotions are felt at all. This is because emotions do four things, and this is important, so underline this. It allows us to experience what is around us. It allows us to choose how to respond and curate our lives. It drives us to do things. And finally, my second speaker will talk about how negative emotions allow individuals to assert our dignity when infringed upon. Note here that all four aspects are enabled and heightened by extreme emotions. Moving on to my first argument then, why intense emotions specifically are an integral part of what makes us human. So the first aspect of this is allowing us to experience what is around us to the fullest extent. If you think about it, human beings are just sacks of atoms floating around the universe. And what gives life its meaning, purpose, and beauty is how we feel it. And how we feel it is through our emotions. Blunting our emotions and never experiencing extreme ones is similar to living in a state of sensory deprivation. You do feel emotions, but importantly, these emotions are not meaningfully impactful for you to experience the varieties of the world. On our side, attending your wedding is level 100 happiness, and getting a cupcake from a friend is level 5 happiness. There's a difference of like 95 levels here, but on their side, both events will probably be of similar intensity because you're both happy with negligible emotional distinctions. The reason why this is harmful can be interpreted as the whole sensory deprivation thing I mentioned earlier. Underline this, by the way, and without fluctuation in experience, it's just like sitting through a 6-hour-long school lecture where the most interesting thing is when the HDMI cable disconnects. Except this lecture is your life. We think your life should be something which should be painted and adorned with all sorts of experiences, be it good or bad. This makes their side makes lives less meaningful and, dare I say, unbearable. In fact, by the way, bad emotions only make us treasure the good ones more. Happiness is relative. And if your entire scale of emotion is just 0 to 5, you'll experience negligible relative happiness or exuberance in your life. The second aspect of this is that extreme emotions allow us to choose how to respond and choose how to curate our lives. In the world that we live in, intense emotions are the means for us to remember certain things, whether good or bad. So in their world, because all emotions are almost indistinguishable, it becomes very difficult to truly retain things which are significant in your life, in your memory, and in the meaning you derive from them. We're not saying you'll completely forget your marriage, but in their world, your marriage is just as emotional as getting a red packet on Chinese New Year. On our side, these extreme ends will be etched in our memories, and that's what makes us who we are. No, thank you. Second argument on why intense emotions change society for the better. Emotions are underrated in the sense that really everything we don't do instinctually is done emotionally, no matter how rational it may be. This is because rational systems themselves, like utilitarianism, are premised on the strong emotional foundation of empathy, what makes me happy. And intense emotions are the most efficient and powerful fuel source to drive our society towards a more equitable and moral future. It motivates people to defy the status quo, even though it may appear as irrational, and it compels us to step beyond our comfort zone and seek change and redress. For example, the only reason why slavery was abolished was because of the intense emotion of abhorrence and disgust that people felt for the unjust treatment of slaves. The reason why the suffrage movement gained so much traction to fight for a more equitable society for women is because of the intense feelings of empathy and admiration for Emily Davidson, who threw herself on the horse racetrack to protest for the unfair treatment of women. Moral principles are structurally and deeply enshrined in intense emotions. The reason why loyalty and treason is met with such high punishment is because of the intense contempt experienced by those who have been betrayed. Our Constitution and our morality is premised on its defense by intense emotions. At the end of this, intense emotions defend us from injustice, fuel us towards a brighter future, and undergird our humanity. For all those reasons, side with opposition.
We prefer a world in which there are no emotions. Oh wait, no, the motion reads, we prefer a world in which there are no extreme emotions. Judge, this debate has become a definition challenge. I urge you to go back to your dictionary. Extreme means reaching the highest degree. Extreme means extreme. They can't change the definition on their side of the world, and we have done that the entire debate. We're talking about emotions that are on the edge, that cause you to murder people, to commit suicide because of this great sudden surge of emotion. They continue to misunderstand emotion, and they don't create actual meaningful discourse about exactly what extreme emotions mean. All they're talking about are things that are non-unique, because we can achieve the same things with strong emotions, with moderate emotions. For example, the things that they tell you about growth, we still have that because we still have emotions. So the main question in this debate is that where do people have more valuable interactions? Is that prop or ob's world? Ob tells you two things on this clash. Firstly, there's social movements, but both Deputy and Webb has told you about the comparison to what they have is that they talk about there's extreme and violent movements, while we have advocacy groups that are driven more by rationality. We have already told you in the Deputy speech that advocacy groups are much more likely to succeed because violence discourages these leaders to actually take up these movements, and also things that are driven by rationality are more likely to be long-term. There's no response from them. Webb has also told you about how these extreme movements look like civil unrest and terrorism. The only response they give you is that the world right now isn't crashing and burning. But know how A, that doesn't mean we should try to make it better at all. And B, know how the majority of problems in the world right now are caused by extreme emotions. For example, like ISIS's extreme hate, right? So and then they also talk about how terrorists are trained to be rational. But here's another major contradiction. The example they gave you when in second speech, in the deputy speech, is about how a lady threw herself in front of a truck in the 1800s to show advocacy. This exactly demonstrates on their side of the world, they get things like suicide bombing that not only hurt themselves but also a lot of other people. This also shows that this doesn't actually provide solvency, because after the woman threw herself in front of the truck, she never solved the problem. She never actually she was advocating for feminism, but she didn't actually get this kind of feminism that she wanted. So know how this just means that they harm themselves. The so-called movements they give are so violent that not only they harm themselves but also others. But then B, it provides no solvency, because people are just more likely to hate things that are more violent. We have already told you that in that speech. They have no response. The second thing they told you then is personal growth. Both Deputy and Webb has already responded to this by saying that you don't need extreme emotions to grow. It's not extreme emotions that make you yourself, it's emotions that do, and we still have emotions on our side of the world. If you're just bred by extreme emotions, it will turn you into an extremely violent person, and we tell you that that's exactly what we don't want, right? We don't want you to grow up and your growth process to be plagued by these extreme emotions that cause you to have depression, to cause you to have anxiety, that makes you feel bad about yourself and more likely to end your life. The only thing they say in response to the crimes made out of passion is law. We have already told you in deputy speech the laws are reactive. The harms have already happened before law enforcement can prosecute. This means people are already harmed on this side of the world. These lives can never come back. On our side, these crimes don't happen in the first place. So we have already told you in all our lines that we actually prevent the actual problems from happening in the first place. We prevent them from happening. We're more proactive. So even in their best case scenario, where you buy all the platitudes they give you about how it's part of our human nature, they can never outweigh our impact of millions of lives saved from decreased crime and health issues from addiction and mental illness, which they never rebutted in the first place. We're more proactive. We actually solve the problems before it is even a problem. So proud to propose.
We on Negative start off with the premise that the species of humans were born to experience the world that we currently live in. So let's illustrate a current situation. For example, let's say you are living in a white room and you only get white bread and white milk. Why then do we think that people will go insane in this situation, which is a documented torture method? We hypothesize that is because it blunts the human ability to experience the world through sensory deprivation. And we posit that what affirmative is doing is a similar situation with emotions. We want to clarify that just because we support this motion doesn't mean that everyone, when we oppose this motion, doesn't mean that everyone in the world always experiences extreme emotions. And as clarified, it will be catered to the particular context of that situation. Before that, we just want to clarify what exactly it means when a world where there's no extreme emotions, because that sort of seems to be the contention on their part. I think it's a pincer imposed upon them that are trying to escape, because they're trying to claim lots of the benefits we're saying with emotions by saying we still have moderate emotions. But recognize that that contradicts any of the benefits they want to claim on their side of rationality, because emotions and rationality, per their framing, is dichotomous. So what exactly do we mean by extreme emotions and no extreme emotions? I think you can sort of use like a rating scale which Daniel has proposed. Let's say in our world, which is the current status quo, the maximum level of joy, the maximum level of anger you can reach is 100. In their world, it's probably like 10 or 5, which means, yes, per their framing, you do experience emotions. But for example, winning the lottery would feel as the status quo equivalent of like getting a cupcake from a friend. So that's the analogy that we're starting off with. We want to just argue that strategically, what we are saying is a lot of the harms they're saying are legitimate. That's just the price we are willing to pay to experience the human emotion at large. Because it might be objectively true that the best way to treat our children via utilitarian metrics is to keep them locked up in houses to make sure they don't go outside and accidentally get kidnapped. But we clearly allow children to go to theme parks. We allow children to do things which may be a little bit dangerous for them in order for them to experience their lives, which we think people ought to be. And it's a similar context in terms of emotions. 3 clashes then in this debate. I'm going to first talk about human safety and interaction, which is the bulk of their case, and I'm going to engage with them. They talk about preventing crimes of passion. I have 4 responses. Firstly, we flip this claim. You actually have more instances of psychopathic crimes, premeditated crimes, where the perpetrators lack any guilt and any extreme guilt towards the victims and any extreme feelings of empathy, which means that they are more likely to perpetrate those crimes anyways. Secondly, there are lots of other reasons for crime, for example, systemic issues or premeditated. Thirdly, there are lots of currently existing mechanisms to protect it in the status quo, things like laws, you get jailed up. And fourthly, and very importantly, that is literally something we are willing to trade off for all the benefits that we're wanting to claim about literally being able to live the lives that we're being able to. Because how many instances of crimes of passion are there really in the world versus the denial of 7 billion people, 8 billion in fact, to lead the lives that we think are so important to them. Next, they talk about better human interaction. I find this quite interesting. They say it's very good for you to talk to your partner in a rational manner. I just posit that it's quite unbearable to live with a person for 40 years fueled by rationality. Like you calculated out their salary and deemed that they were the most rational human being in the world for you to marry to. I just posit that's really just not a very beautiful thing for us to lead our lives. And there's nothing wrong with falling madly with and willing to do anything for your wife, for instance. And we think that's what breeds more healthy relationships in the status quo. And secondly, the whole example of if you're being cheated by your wife, you're going to have a rational conversation. Again, as Daniel already pointed out, we're completely fine with defending a world where people feel madly angry, because that is something which is massively infringed upon. That's a burden we're willing to take. Next, this whole idea of addiction. Very quickly, their premise is that you have more psychological distress where you have extreme emotions. I can easily flip this, because when people get depression, it's when they feel that their lives are no longer meaningful. And that's precisely what we posit will be when your life has no extreme emotions, which I'll go into later. And furthermore, there are a variety of mechanisms in the status quo, no thank you, which people can use and cope, right? That does not justification to keep people in a glass box for the rest of their life, which I think what their side does. Next, second question, let's talk about the human experience. And this was something we received little engagement with, other than saying that emotions can also do this too. I'm going to give you specific reasons, which by the way, Daniel already gave you, as to why extreme emotions are the exclusive mechanisms for us to do this. What things can it do? Firstly, our emotions allow us to experience what is around us. Sure, your normal emotions can do that too, but they do it to a far lesser scale as per when we have extreme emotions, where we can experience the highs of during your marriage, of falling in love, of going on the extreme thrills of going on a roller coaster, and we also experience the extreme grief when our loved ones pass away or our pets die. That is precisely what makes life so meaningful. It's because of the scale of emotions that we can experience. Secondly, Daniel talks about how this allows us to curate our lives for the better. It allows us to have memories of the past. Recognize that right now, if I ask you to name something you remember of the past, it is probably something which has triggered a level of extreme emotion and not just the everyday, low spectrum of emotion, which is positive going to happen on their side. And thirdly, it also drives, and this is the third thing on social change, which we receive also little engagement with, it drives people to go out of the comfort zone to do things. What they said is you can still be extremely committed towards the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that's quite disingenuous because they harp on this whole idea of rationality. But you know what is most rational for the suffrage movement during the time they were advocating? It was to not advocate because at that time, rationally, there was no hope that women were able to get votes. It was only because they managed to harness the extreme emotions and extreme displeasure of such mistreatment at that time they were able to succeed in the first place. So if anything on our side, social movements are far more powerful to help people to go out of their comfort zone. Before I move on, sure.
So do you advocate for terrorism as well?
Well, it seems like they're taking the extreme end of extreme emotions. And furthermore, you know what's one interesting thing? During terrorist trainings, they teach you not to be emotional, to sell yourself out to this organization. So if anything, terrorism is probably easier on their side because you can literally radicalize yourself so much more easily. With that, let's move on to my argument then as to why intense negative emotions, which presumably takes them at the best, allows individuals to assert their own dignity. The premise of this is that people on both sides will probably still experience some levels of injustice, as we've given you many reasons that are systemic. For example, instances of sexual assault. In those instances, we think that the ability for you to experience negative and specifically intense negative emotions is incredibly important in being commensurate enough to defend your own dignity. It is because it is your intense emotions which allows you to defend yourself from the perpetrator. It is because you remember these negative emotions so that you're able to take action for it later in the future. On their side, people will pass this over as just an inconvenience, or at worst, the equivalent to, for example, someone bumping into you. They won't take into account the amount of defense needed for their own dignity, which is what we think intense emotions exclusively offer. For those reasons, we're incredibly proud to negate.
This debate is about the extreme emotions. It's about the extreme ends. It's about the edge. Our opponents gave you the spectrum of negative 100 to 100. Well, we tell you that removing the extreme emotions, just make it negative 90 to 90. We remove the extreme emotions that cause harm to society. So now I'll be rebutting the points made by our opponents. Then I'll move on to clash points explaining why we're way over our opponents in each. First, our opponents say that crime of passion won't happen. So while they were arguing for this, he explained that when your best friend or your dog dies, you are allowed to feel sad. Well, we agree, but what does extreme sadness look like? It looks like if your best friend dies, you binge eat for days and you fall into depression, which is extreme sadness. Look, sadness is still existence on our side, and you're still allowed to feel sadness when your best friend dies. It's just that we don't allow extreme sadness to a point where there's no rationality in your decisions. And secondly, our opponents say that no strong emotions, that there are no strong empathy, and that's what makes us human. But we say that empathy is not an emotion in itself. It is a capacity to think both rationally and emotionally. And that's what empathy does. Empathy makes you think in someone else's shoes. And empathy does not exist when there are strong emotions. Empathy does not exist when you're feeling extreme madness. You can't think in someone else's shoes when you feel like you want to kill them because you feel extreme madness. And next, our opponents say that intense emotion makes it impossible to leave toxic marriages as a rebuttal to our claim. We tell you that on our side, a person can still leave toxic marriages and toxic relationships, but under careful consideration. And only on our side do they leave after careful consideration. On our opponent's side, a person sees their partner cheat on them, a person sees their partner does something bad, and they feel extreme anger and extreme disgust. What happens is they immediately leave their partner, or even worse, they might even want to kill their partner, feel extreme madness to a point where they feel like hurting their partner. However, what we propose on our side when we remove these extreme emotions is that these people have time to think carefully, to carefully consider what they're trying to achieve. And this also solves the issue of like a lot of people regretting it right after, like they want to leave their partner because they left their partner in the first case due to these extreme emotions. And next, our opponents give the claim on how extreme emotions makes us human and experiences. No, thank you. Well, we tell you that we still have emotions, and emotions itself is what makes us human. What makes us human is not extreme emotion. What makes us human is not extreme madness, but it is that we feel empathy and we can think for others. It's not extreme emotion. And next, our opponents say that social movements won't happen without extreme emotions. Well, we tell you that social movements still happen on our side. What our opponents have is violent social movements that are spurred by extreme emotions. What we have on our side is advocacy groups that, for example, stand up for child rights. And extreme emotions can actually lead to extremism and polarization within social justice movements. Because why is this? While strong emotions can mobilize people, extreme emotions often push individuals towards radical positions. They push them towards radical decisions. And this creates deep divisions and polarizing communities. And the impact of this is that polarization can actually fracture justice movements, and this leads to diminishing their ability to create broad coalitions necessary for actual substantial change. And without a balanced approach that incorporates both emotional appeal and rational strategy, social justice movements risk burning out or failing to achieve their deeper systematic objectives. And the long-term success requires measured, thoughtful actions that can adapt to particular circumstances and sustain support. Well, extreme emotions can lead to violence and civil unrest as well. And this undermines the legitimacy of social justice movements in the first place. And when emotions run extremely high, they can lead to actions that are destructive rather than constructive. And this includes violence, vandalism, and other forms of civil arrest, which undermines the whole purpose of social justice in the first place. No, thank you. And next, basically what we're trying to say is our opponents, when they say that extreme emotions towards social justice movements, they're actually arguing the kind of activism they create is terrorism. For example, terrorists also think of themselves as social justice movements. For example, ISIS thinks that they're advocating for the Muslims. What they're spurred by is extreme emotion, and that's what makes them a violent organization. And next, I'll be moving on to my clash points. So the first clash point we provided is which side provides more peaceful society. So our opponents say that
POI.
Yes, I'll take your POI.
So I think we can agree that status quo right now, there is extreme emotions. Is the world crashing and burning as per what you described?
Well, yes, kind of. But what we are saying is that without social justice movements, without extreme emotions, it will be even worse. What you say that there are extreme emotions in our world, it is already bad enough. There are already terrorist groups. Imagine what happens when you have these extreme emotions that creates more terrorist groups, more social justice movements that are basically just terrorist groups. And now, onto our clash points. So which side provides a more peaceful society? So our opponents say that without extreme emotions, there are no social justice movements. And we have already proven this false because we have said that the social movements they create are just basically terrorist acts. Because what these social justice movements are spurred by is extreme madness, extreme disappointment. And what this causes is violent and civil unrest. And what we are proposing is that without these extreme emotions, people are allowed to think rationally. They can think with careful consideration before they do their actions. And the next clash points is where do humans have more valuable interactions? So our opponents say that extreme emotions makes us human. However, what we propose is that human emotions itself makes us human, not extreme emotions. And that's what already makes us human. And our current interactions with the world and other people around us are valuable. And what is making it not valuable, what is making it violent is these extreme emotions that are stopping it from actually being valuable. Thank you. We strongly urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Before I begin my rebuttals, firstly, a few housekeeping matters. I'd like to point out there's been a lot of tension in that case. They claim in their framing and setup and their entire first figure, the emotion and rationality are mutually exclusive. They have to make some kind of trade-off in order to exchange reality or emotion for rationality for emotion or vice versa. Yet they also want us to have moderate or even strong emotion. Clearly, they see that principally it is justified that it be worth the trade-off rationality for emotion to some extent. When in the second speaker they come out to told us you can actually go up to 19 in the emotional scale. First, I have to point out this is disingenuous, it is late, and it's generally trying to co-op our points without taking responsibility for any of the negatives, right? I can flip this argument and say that they've never convincingly explained why strong emotions is the bar they draw, or why going beyond that has any negatives. In fact, we can flip this and say that all the negatives that bring with emotion also apply to their side, right? When you have strong emotions, you don't have to want to kill yourself to be depressed. Being apathetic, lethargic, and not wanting to do anything, which is something that can happen on their side if they want to push quote unquote strong emotions, it's also depression and almost as bad, if not equally harmful, than our comparative. On to my rebuttals, and their first point or first clash, which is about extreme bad emotions, something I think they really focus on and they want to bring us down to this point. Firstly, I tell you that as my first and second speaker has told you, it's meaningful or it should not be bad to feel things like sadness, right? For example, when I lose a family member, sadness is what catalyzes our care and concern for this person. When someone mistreats me, I want to feel angry or extremely angry if they mistreat me a lot, because that's an act of self-defense against the harms the person is perpetrating on me. Crucially, this only works in extreme emotions, because there are extreme situations like these that warrant extreme emotional responses. If you felt the same intensity of emotion when reacting to being beaten and abused as when reacting to losing a video game, your life would literally just be shallow and devoid of meaning, which my first and second speaker have already explained. So the trade-off on our side, which is we are willing to make, is you can feel extreme sadness or extreme anger, sure, but you can also feel extreme happiness, extreme love, and like all these extremely good emotions as well. Importantly, extreme negative emotions are or can be generally regulated by society, such that their harmful impacts can be mitigated or minimized, right? You can feel extremely angry, but also know that you may not have to express your extreme anger by beating up someone. You can have like meaningful ways to relieve even extreme anger, but you can't artificially induce extreme good emotions. So this is a unique benefit on our side that I don't think their side is going to be able to do. Secondly, the point about minimizing harm, like crimes of passion, terrorism, whatever. So firstly, like the POI that was just given, I'd like to point out that we literally live in a world of extreme emotions. All of us here are capable of feeling extreme emotions, and yet none of us are going to go out and murder someone, right? Like the world we live in right now may not be perfect, but it's not crashing and burning as side propositions seem to think a world of extreme emotions would be doing. Like I'm the capability to feel extreme emotions, but if I lose this debate, I'm not going to go out and commit a shooting. So I'm going to draw an analogy, which I think my second speaker has given that wasn't really responded to. Empirically, it might be true that forcing children to stay indoors, like of keep making them being a helicopter parent for them would probably be safer, but that's probably not what we want for our children, or at least I would hope not, because we want them to see the world, to experience what it feels to live a life, even if they will fall down and get hurt along the way. Sure, taking them at their best, they may feel safe from, yes.
Everything in the status quo, like terrorism, like eco-terrorism, it has happening in the status quo. The dictionary definition for extreme is the highest degree, and we believe that involves terrorism. Please explain why that is great.
Okay, firstly, I think my speaker already told you, but the first thing that they teach you in terrorism training is you have to be emotionless and kill people. And secondly, I have to tell you that a lot of terrorists are like psychopaths who have no emotion either way. So like, presumably on your side, there's still going to be psychopaths who commit shootings just because, right? They're not going to feel regret, they're not going to feel empathy, whatever. So going on, taking them at their best, they make people quote unquote safe from hurt in some nebulous way, but they also deprive them of the chance to experience the full range of delightful and depressing things that life has to offer, which again has been explained in first and second, and again has generally gone unresponded to. So let's flip this. On their side, they're probably going to be psychopathic criminals, and they're going to be psychopathic crimes committed in cold blood, which is probably going to be a lot more likely because they don't have the capacity, or at least don't have as much capacity to feel regret or like feel regret for what they've done, which is what prevents normal murderers from becoming serial killers, from becoming psychopaths and mass murderers. And so all these things that inhibit extreme actions will also be diminished on their side. So at best, it's a wash. So yeah, empathy may not be an emotion, but it may be partly driven by logic. But on your side, where logic is the overriding factor, it is then possible to totally calculate, fully rationally, that killing someone or sabotaging their career prospects, or like bombing an opera house to advance your own ideology is logically the best thing to do in your favor. So if or when it comes down to it, we're willing to trade off that we may have more crimes of passion in exchange for having a lot less psychopaths, and in exchange for all the benefits of enjoying extreme positive emotions that their side literally cannot access. Thirdly, about rationality, which is something that first speaker brought up, I feel was pretty much dropped in second speaker. They shifted their case towards like strong emotions instead of rational, which like is a tension that I pointed out before. So firstly, individuals are generally rational most, if not all of the time, right? So accepting people who have mental disorders, people generally do not fly on a rage or go into a depression over small things. So like the only times where these things happen is when there are extreme situations that warrant these emotions in the first place. And like, just to point out that when you're experiencing life, you can experience situations that test your emotional response from 0 to 100. But insofar that you have your emotional response kept at 90, you're never going to be able to handle these things that genuinely do warrant an extreme emotional response, right? So unless their side can come out and tell us that 0 situations in your entire life will warrant these extreme emotional responses, I don't think they can claim all the benefits that we do. And going on, even there are examples, for example, feeling extremely angry that your spouse cheated on you, for instance, only happens if you really care about your spouse and genuinely thought they were a soulmate, right? And so if you're like, and in these instances, I would argue that it is justified to feel betrayed. It's justified to feel angry and sad when sometimes you thought you'd be your best friend for life, someone thought your soulmate, your only confidant, will go ahead and betray you like that. This is an extreme situation that hence justifies these extreme emotional responses. So on the flip side, if you're forced into something like arranged marriage, for instance, you probably wouldn't care as much if your spouse cheated on you, because it's simply something that does not warrant as such emotional response. And so like what they fail to recognize is that humans generally do not have like irrational emotional responses to things that could be handled by a less emotional response. A small thing isn't going to make you lose your temper. Isn't going to make you like extremely depressed unless you're some form of mental illness, which I would argue is a wash on both sides, because on their side, mental illness will simply manifest in a different way. For example, like psychopathy, which I've already mentioned. And so in the vast majority, if not all cases, you are going to feel extreme emotions over tiny things. It's only going to be towards these extreme situations where it is genuinely justified for them to use these extreme emotions as a form of self-defense, or as a form of extreme happiness when you like accomplish your life goals, or when you finally met your soulmate. And these are things that they can never fully replicate. These are things that they can never fully lay claim to, because on their side, people are simply incapable of feeling these emotions. Even in these extreme scenarios, they're probably just going to be maybe slightly strongly angry or slightly strongly sad over something that should and on our side will warrant an extreme response. Extreme emotions may not be rational, but the human experience is not. Side with opposition.
To see a world where extreme emotions are present, we need to look no further than the status quo itself. And this is important because in terms of adjudication, any of the harms in which affirmative is trying to claim must be taken in the context of the world itself, which means that any of the problems that are solved, which we think are a bit overclaimed, must be contextualized in the fact that the status quo is not indeed crashing and burning. I'll first like to clarify at the start that this interesting reframe which came out in third about this whole idea that, the idea of extreme emotions is only those hundreds at either end, which means one vote is -100 to 100, the other vote is at -99 to 90. I think that's quite disingenuous. It's probably not in the spirit of this motion, and the reason for that is because it's unclear as to why we draw the line of extreme only at rationality, and presumably it's a far more reasonable to assume that extreme emotions just means those highs in which people experience like you and I, and they don't necessarily transcend rationality, just as a clarification. So, as an illustration, what do we think a world would look like when there are no extreme emotions? Because it's sort of quite hard for us creatures with extreme emotions to conceive that, right? And I think it's a bit like, for example, going through a lecture or going through like an equity briefing before a debate, except that equity briefing will last not 15 minutes, but probably like 60 years of the rest of your life, or like 70 or 80. And I just intuitively thinking of that, yes, that is rather utilitarian by their claims, because we don't have any pieces of fun. But having to go through life like that, where you don't experience things like falling in love, where you don't experience things like grief, just doesn't seem very meaningful. And why exactly then is extreme emotion so important in giving life its meaning? We think firstly it's about the whole idea of valuing emotions. You value it a lot more when you have went through the extreme ends, because joys will feel a lot more joyful and sadness will feel a lot more painful, which we think is the contrasting elements of the human condition. Secondly, and this is arguably more important, is the ability for you to retain certain memories in life. Because if you go through every life just like on a ship sailing in calm waters, you literally have nothing you can possibly recall to, because every day feels almost identical towards you, where there's no meaningful distinctions in the amount of emotions that you're able to experience. And that is why, regardless, frankly, of the practical outcomes, which we have already mitigated, we are willing to, and we are importantly, we negate a world where there's no extreme emotions. Next, let's talk about rationality. I think we can buy the argument that on our side, people won't be rational. But I'm willing to question, and we have questioned, why exactly rationality is so good all the time. We've given you those examples in the instances where passion or immense amounts of feeling are a lot more meaningful. For example, in relationships, I think we find the fact that love is so transcendent a lot better than we find the idea of being in a relationship rationally and calculatively. Secondly, rational thinking might also be wrong in circumstances where you're faced with things like oppressive state structures, which rationally you cannot overcome. But only when you feel that feeling of extreme emotion can you will yourself over it, which also rebuts all their arguments. Thirdly, then, it's also the feeling of hope you have, even though rationally you might not have any hope. We're talking about like coal miners trapped under the earth. Objectively and rationally, they might not be able to escape. So that feeling of hope they're able to muster is also something meaningful towards them. The issues of safety as already mitigate is probably a wash on both sides. There are things like laws in place. I think in the status quo, that's a good example of that. The important thing is then, question, when exactly do individuals experience extreme emotions, and adjudicate on that basis? We posit there are a couple of circumstances in which extreme emotions are incredibly important, where you have been infringed upon by another person to a large degree, where you have received a massive award and you deserve to celebrate, or where you're faced with a situation which requires massive amounts of grief. It is within our human condition, and it is meaningful for us to be able to experience those extreme emotions. For those reasons, we are unwilling to blunt the human condition we are extremely proud to negate.
We prefer a world in which there are no emotions. Oh wait, no, the motion reads, we prefer a world in which there are no extreme emotions. Judge, this debate has become a definition challenge. I urge you to go back to your dictionary. Extreme means reaching the highest degree. Extreme means extreme. They can't change the definition on their side of the world, and they have done that the entire debate. We're talking about emotions that are on the edge, that cause you to murder people, to commit suicide because of this great sudden surge of emotion. They continue to misunderstand emotion, and they don't create actual meaningful discourse about exactly what extreme emotions mean. All they're talking about are things that are non-unique because we can achieve the same things with strong emotions, with moderate emotions. For example, the things that they tell you about growth, we still have that because we still have emotions. So the main question in this debate is that where do people have more valuable interactions? Is that prop or ob's world? Ob tells you two things on this clash. Firstly, there's social movements, but both Deputy and Webb has told you about the comparison to what they have is that they talk about there's extreme and violent movements, while we have advocacy groups that are driven more by rationality. We have already told you in the Deputy speech that advocacy groups are much more likely to succeed as because violence discourages these leaders to actually take up these movements, and also things that are driven by rationality are more likely to be long term. There's no response from them. Webb has also told you about how these extreme movements look like civil unrest and terrorism. The only response they give you is that the world right now isn't crashing and burning. But know how A, that doesn't mean we should try to make it better at all. But and B, know how the majority of problems in the world right now are caused by extreme emotions. For example, like ISIS's extreme hate, right? So and then they also talk about how terrorists are trained to be rational. But here's a major contradiction. The example they gave you when in second speech, in the deputy speech, is about how a lady threw herself in front of a truck in the 1800s to show advocacy. This exactly demonstrates on their side of the world, they get things like suicide bombing that not only hurt themselves but also a lot of other people. This also shows that this doesn't actually provide solvency, because after the woman threw herself in front of the truck, she never solved the problem. She never actually she was advocating for feminism, but she didn't actually get this kind of feminism that she wanted. So know how this just means that they harm themselves. The so-called movements they give are so violent that not only they harm themselves but also others. But then B, it provides no solvency because people are just more likely to hate things that are more violent. We have already told you that in that speech. They have no response. The second thing they told you then is personal growth. Both Deputy and Webb has already responded to this by saying that you don't need extreme emotions to grow. It's not extreme emotions that make you yourself, it's emotions that do, and we still have emotions on our side of the world. If you're just bred by extreme emotions, it will turn you into an extremely violent person, and we tell you that that's exactly what we don't want, right? We don't want you to grow up and your growth process to be plagued by these extreme emotions that cause you to have depression, to cause you to have anxiety, that makes you feel bad about yourself and more likely to end your life. The only thing they say in response to the crimes made out of passion is law. We have already told you in deputy speech the laws are reactive. The harms have already happened before law enforcement can prosecute. This means people are already harmed on this side of the world. These lives can never come back. On our side, these crimes don't happen in the first place. So we have already told you in all our lines that we actually prevent the actual problems from happening in the first place. We prevent them from happening. We're more proactive. So even in the best case scenario, where you buy all the platitudes they give you about how it's part of our human nature, they can never outweigh our impact of millions of lives saved from decreased crime and health issues from addiction and mental illness, which they never rebutted in the first place. We're more proactive. We actually solve the problems before it is even a problem. So proud to propose.